Mr. Chairman.
Move that the question be now put.
I call the Honourable Trevor Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to acknowledge that since I had an earlier call in this debate, there's been quite a lot said by a number of members, and I do want to go back over in rebuttal of some of the points made. And I think one of the first points, or one of the first members I want to address is John O'Naylor, who spoke earlier in the debate, and he in his discussion totally failed to make the case for not hearing the people who wanted an amendment to the purpose clause. A large number of people, 747 people, wanted an amendment to the purpose clause so that provision would be made for one referendum, not two. And I do want to acknowledge the point that he's made on, I think, points of order and by interjection. There is, at least according to the Oxford Concise, some of the modernisms have crept in, and this by saying referendums, it is actually acceptable. Although I think probably when you and I went to school, sir, it wouldn't have been. It would have been referenda.
Mr. Chairman,
but,
he's a lot younger than you.
I know he looks a lot younger. I'm not sure that he's significant. Well, maybe he is. Mr. Chairman, the point that I'm trying to make, and I really want to focus on in this purpose clause, is whether we should have the opportunity to have one instead of two referenda. Now, I want to say, no, even if it was changed, I would still vote against it. But part of the deal with the committee stages of the whole House is having accepted, albeit by quite a narrow margin, the principle that this bill is going through. It's now our responsibility to look at the detail of the bill and whether it fulfils the overall objectives, the principles that we agreed to in the second reading, in the best possible way. And the case that I am making is, sir, that it would be better for New Zealand if we had a clear approach at the beginning, whereby individuals were given the choice whether or not they wanted to proceed with a second referendum or not, and as well as being clear in the way that we were with the MMP legislation. And I do find it slightly ironic that the front row for the National Party on this, the front row for the National Party, the core of the Select Committee who rejected the 747 people who wanted to be heard, are Alfred Naro, John O'Naylor and Chris Bishop, none of whom would have been present in the House if in fact the MMP referendum had not been shaped in the way that it was. So there was a system which at the time was regarded as fair, a system which was Paul Foster Bill points out the New Zealand First members in a way, in a way which I think is particularly interesting. But they know it and they accept it, and they do the job of going and listening to the people within the electorates and the people around them and where they live. Whereas National Party members block voted, no, absolutely on the point, block voted to deny people who wanted the purpose clause changed, denied 747 of those people the right to attend the committee. And I just think, I think that is, that is outrageous. It's the Todd McClay approach to running a select committee. It's the sort of select committee you have to have hearings on a bill when you don't really want to have hearings because you just want to ramrod the thing through. Mr. Speaker, there are some other points, and I do want to ask whether this government is one which really enjoys churning up more paper than is necessary. Why, for example, Mr. Chairman,
The Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr. Chairman, why, for example, as we look through the interpretation clause of this bill, do we have to have declined the Clerk of the House? I mean, how many Clerks of the House are there in New Zealand? It says Clerk of the House means the Clerk of the House of Representatives. Now, is that a necessary part of the legislation to make it work? Which house are we talking about? You know, we're not talking about David Clark's house, are we? It's spelt differently. We're talking about the Clerk of the House of Why is that necessary? Why do we need the current New Zealand flag, means the flag declared by Section 5.1 of the flag's emblems, names protection. We know what the current New Zealand flag is. It's fairly well indicated in this House at the moment. And as it happens, Mr. Speaker, I spent some time, short period of time today, in the foyer on the I suppose it's the southeast foyer of the executive wing on the ground floor. And what did I see there? The New Zealand flag that was part of the World Trade Centre bombing. You know, and that just sort of brought back to me that it's not only at wartime, but there are some other times where flags are particularly. I just want to work through. Electoral Commission. Why Paul Goldsmith, the Honourable Paul Goldsmith, the Minister in the Chair, why do we have to have on line 19 and 20 on the interpretation clause on page 5, why do we have to have Electoral Commission defined? What defined as the Electoral Commission established by Section 4B of the Electoral Act 1993. How many Electoral Commissions do we have in New Zealand? I just want to know why, Mr. Chairman, why is it that we are doing within this legislation stuff that is unnecessary? And I'm going to be really interested in the Minister's response to this. Some of them, may be necessary. Minister means the Minister of the Crown. Well, chances are that was the case. It was, it's going to be the Reverend Dr. David Clark in his new incarnation, but not in the not the sort of minister that he is at the moment. So just working through my question to the minister who was in the chair is whether promoters, whether it's necessary to have promoters referred to in the interpretation phase. It's already in the bill. It's already in the bill. There's sort of like an assumption here. There's an assumption that people who are reading this legislation are just thick, that they do not understand the approach that should be taken. And I think it's fair to say, and it was made very clear in the speech by Chris Bishop, that he thought people could not understand having two questions asked on the same day. Do you want to change, and if so, what sort? As I indicated earlier, that was the approach that was taken earlier. Returning officer. Do we really need, with all our electoral legislation at the moment, to redefine our returning officer? Do we need to define working day? Well, actually, working day is pretty well defined in lots of pieces of legislation at the beginning. And Paul Goldsmith, is there any chance, Mr. Goldsmith, of telling us why it is necessary to have a different definition of working day in this legislation, or to repeat the definition of working day in this legislation that is any different from the generally accepted form of what a working day is elsewhere in legislation? I also want to ask the Minister whether he is absolutely satisfied with the general description of the preferential voting system, without wanting to get too much further into the legislation, whether he thinks the government is taking too much on itself with its ability to adjust parts of this legislation by way of order in council. And because that's what, Mr Chairman,
I call